expect next. The second part will be a discussion with two esteemed members of Congress. First from the House, Representative Moulton, and then from the Senate, Senator Murphy are going to join us. I do want to tell you that there's been a slight change in time and that they are going to join us at 3 o'clock instead of 3:30 because there is an important vote in the House about the war powers that comes after that. So I just ask all of you at that point, there's probably going to be a little bit of rush as we bring them in, so please all stay seated at that moment so we can get them in. This, of course, events here are on the record, public. We have cameras here. When it is time to ask questions after our initial panel discussion, I ask that you ask the questions in the form of a question and not in the form of a monologue or a diatribe or a position paper or anything else, both to our panel and to our audience. As the moderator for the panel, I will insist upon it. The other thing I also want to say is for those of you who are active users of social media, we have hashtag #ACIraq and hashtag #ACIran that we are using to follow today's events. Let me start off before I invite the panelists to the dais with me to just give a little bit of perspective from my own point of view, which is that the United States and Iraq have successfully, at this point, walked back from the precipice. They have both accomplished things in the short term. The Trump administration has accomplished taking what would otherwise potentially be seen as a very reckless act and walking it back so that it does not lead us to war. But in doing so, setting a new limitations potentially on Iranian behavior. That's no small accomplishment. Iran has also had very strong accomplishments. They have completely reversed their situation in Iraq, which before the crisis, they were tremendously on the defensive. They were losing their influence on the streets, in the corridors of power, even within the Shia community. And now they are as better positioned than they've been any time in a number of years to accomplish their largest goal, which was to expel the United States. So time will tell whether or not a tactical victory for the Trump administration turns into a strategic defeat, or if indeed, through adept diplomacy, we can walk away from war and continue to consolidate our gains. At the same point, there are greater challenges yet to come, including, most importantly, and we'll talk about a few of these, the crisis that is as eminently predictable as difficult it is to deal with, which is the potential nuclear breakout now that Iran has decided to no longer abide by the restrictions on their use of centrifuges. And it's possible that that might happen even before the inauguration of the next American president. So with that, let me invite the three panelists to the stage to talk about all of this. First, coming up, please come on up, is Tom Warwick. I'm going to introduce each one in turn. Tom Warwick was until very recently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Counterterrorism, a job that he held for over a decade, a role that he held for over a decade. He has played roles on Iran, on Iraq, in the State Department, and on all of our counterterrorism work in the Trump administration, in the Obama administration, in the Bush administration. And so he is going to talk to us about what to expect from the Trump administration and what to expect also on a homeland defense point of view. The next member of our panel is Dr. Abbas Khadim, who is the director of our Iraq initiative. He is about as well connected, well informed about what's going on in Iraq as anybody that I know right now. And he will talk to us about not only what's going on now, but what to expect in the future throughout 2020 in Iraq. And finally, Barbara Slavin who is the director of our Future of Iran initiative, and who is an expert on the JCPOA, and amongst many other things. We'll talk about what to expect in terms of Iranian reactions coming forward, and whether or not Iran will continue to behave as it has now, or behave as it has previously, how it will confront the continuing maximum pressure campaign, and so forth. And so with that, I ask you all to give a big round of applause to our panel as we're about to discuss the discussion.
Thank you very much, Will. My name is Tom Warwick, and I'll be going first in this presentation. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes. What I want to focus on is one of the aspects of the current situation that apparently was not in the inner circles of the Trump administration as the policy was being deliberated, at least based on the photographs that we saw of the Situation Room and of the people who were behind the president. But this is a presidency that has focused on America first and on defending the United States from threats from Iran and from its proxies and allies around the world. So what I want to talk about is what we might look ahead to see how this crisis could play out in the homeland. Obviously, we have seen what has happened in Iraq, and we've seen the statements out of Iranian leaders, both making it clear that their goal, as Will said, is to drive the United States from the region, and especially from Iraq. But it's also the case that there have been other things that Iran has been trying to do to counter what the US and other countries are working on. So there are 4 possible attack vectors that we should keep in mind. And there's a framing concept I want to introduce here because it's fundamental to my sense of the way the Islamic Republic of Iran has acted in a host of international venues going back to 1981 when I first started working on Iran in the private sector. And I've seen how this has played itself out in a variety of ways, and it's very much manifested in the way that Iran is potentially taking actions against the United States. It's Iran's peculiar sense of symmetry, which is that what we or our allies do to them, they do back to us, not exactly in the same way, but in a similar way. And this, in fact, makes Iran much more predictable than I think many people who one sees opining on these issues tries to say. So the idea that Iran is reckless or is imperialistic or aggressive actually does not make sense when you look at Iran's perception of what is happening to it, and the fact that it believes in many cases it's acting to remedy an injustice or to even things up. And we actually saw this very clearly on the military side in the statements coming out of Iranian leaders, which my colleagues will be addressing. In the case of terrorism, the last attempted state-sponsored act of terrorism on US soil was Iranian. It was the attempt in 2011 by the IRGC, led by the people, many of the people whose names have been in the news recently, to try to kill the Saudi ambassador Adel al-Jubeir at a restaurant here in Washington, D.C. The plot actually shocked many of us, myself included, because we did not think that the Iranians would do that, and it was only after the fact we all put things together to understand why the Iranians had chosen that particular individual and that particular venue. The last, by the way, previous state-sponsored terrorism on US soil was also by Iran, the killing of a man in a Bethesda neighborhood by someone claiming to act on behalf of the clerical regime. But that having been said, Iran has not chosen state-sponsored terrorism as the primary way in which it tries to get the United States to change US policies. And unlike a lot of people who have talked about this, I have to say we are less likely to see acts of overt Iranian terrorism on US soil than we will some of the other actions I'm going to describe in a few minutes, which are not only likely, they are dead certainties. and I have absolute confidence in predicting Iran is going to do everything else on my list, but terrorism is not necessarily there. But I would caution that we have seen instances where Lebanese Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, has been recruiting what the FBI determined were sleeper agents, people whose jobs it was to live here, to work here, and to potentially be available for action. But what is never known in these cases is what would actually trigger this. The second thing is cyber threats. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI put out a joint intelligence bulletin to state and local law enforcement, alerting them to this. Chris Krebs, who had put out a very helpful warning back in June, talking about Iran's ability to erase hard drives remotely, which was a tactic they had previously used against Saudi Arabia back in 2012. What actually is less well known is that in February of 2012, somebody had erased the hard drives of the National Iranian Oil Company. And then in August, the Iranians erased the hard drives of Saudi Aramco. So those kinds of activities are a certainty and are probably going on even as we speak. And I have to tell you, every time Twitter goes out on my home computer or Netflix has a problem, I'm going to start wondering about this. That I assure you is probably excessive because many U.S. businesses and industries have found ways to prevent these threats from disrupting operations, but the problem is the Iranians are looking for the weakest link, and all they need is one unlocked door. And it's important to remember that in 2010, it took Iran 3 years to go from somebody messing around with centrifuges made by the Siemens company, what's called industrial control systems. It was 3 years before Iran first deployed the same capability against the West. It was 6 months from the time they had hard drives erased on their oil company to when they went after Saudi Arabia's oil company. We've seen recently that the Iranians have reduced the time down to days or hours. And we've also seen instances where things still keep happening to the Iranians in the cyber domain. Sometimes the administration has announced that they have carried out offensive cyber operations. Other times, as happened back in December, which got very little publicity here in the United States, there was an instance where thousands of bank account debit cards were revealed to the public, an issue which, if it had happened here, would have caused major outrage. So update your software, install antivirus software, use two-factor authentication, all of the basic things that my people who are still at DHS are advising you and every other cybersecurity expert. Disinformation operations are going to continue as well. We can expect that the Iranians will be putting out false stories. They will be trying to confuse truths that are emerging. And that is something that I can guarantee you is going to be continued because it's been in the Iranian playbook. And then finally, influence operations. The Iranians aren't as good as the Russians, but they are getting better. There was a major episode revealed by Wired magazine in August of 2018, and I really urge people to go back and pull that up on your computer, because it shocked a lot of people that the Iranians had gone from crude, rudimentary tactics several years ago to being able to mount a very sophisticated operation online. The Iranians are getting better in all of these capabilities, and that's why this is an issue. And so one of the things that I just want to finish with is this thought. When the United States plans what to do about Iran, the president's go-to tools have been sanctions and offensive cyber operations. The problem is that while the government may have good defenses against what the Iranians are capable of doing for government domains, in the private sector, defenses are much less even. And there are weaknesses that need to be addressed, and this needs to be a priority not just for DHS or the FBI or Cybercom or the National Security Agency. This actually has to be something that not just Americans, but Europeans and Middle Easterners and others recognize as a shared civic responsibility for all of us so that these operations do not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abbas?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to put you in the Iraqi scene, probably to just complete the picture. I was in Baghdad in September and in early October, and things were really going very well. The country was finally coming back to normalcy. Baghdad was looking good. No car bombs were going off. The green zone was open, and things were really good. Instead of security and terrorism-related conferences, both of the conferences I attended in September were about the economy and the energy economy. And things were looking good. Then, beginning of October 1, things began to take a turn rapidly to the worst with the protests that took place as of October 1st for the first week of October, and then they put them on hold for a religious occasion of the Arba'in, which is a commemoration of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, and then resumed them back on the 25th of October. And it continued. Those protests pretty much halted Iraqi political life, caused ultimately the death of somewhere around 500 people, and more than 13 to 1,400 people were wounded among the protesters. Also, some security forces were killed, and those led to the disenchantment all across Iraq, especially in the south and central Iraq, and caused the resignation of the government. That is very important to remember when we look at the current crisis. It couldn't have come in a worse time for Iraq, because you have a government that has resigned. The first time in the Iraqi experience in post-2003 that we had a government resignation. The Iraqis are trying to figure out how to deal with this situation, because there is no precedent and there are no set written rules on what to do, what the government can do, what it cannot do, how to replace the government. In fact, the constitutional framework for replacing the government already passed, and they do not know how to go about making that replacement. So a government that has resigned, a caretaker government with truncated authorities, and also a divided parliament, divided population because of the protests. Some are against the government, some for the government. For the first time, you started seeing the Iraqi population voicing their opinions against the foreign influence, whether it's Iran, the United States, and also the domestic actors in Iraq. Iraq has many armed groups that are, in a way, on paper, they are state actors, but in the reality, on the ground, they are not really state actors, because they do not respond to every direction from the commander-in-chief. So Iraq is really in a very hard situation. Then you started seeing the escalation of events, starting with the attack on an Iraqi base that led to the death of an American citizen, a contractor, then a retaliation from the United States on a camp, a base that hosted the Popular Mobilization Units. This led to the death of somewhere around 25 to 30 Iraqi Popular Mobilization Units members, and the response to it was a siege and an attack on the Iraqi embassy, and this started as a sit-in, and then it ended up with burning and other destruction at the outside of the embassy, and a little bit in the beginning of the interest. For those who have been or seen the Iraqi embassy, the US Embassy in Baghdad, it's a big compound. It is, and there is what is at the outside, some offices, the reception, etc., and then you drive inside to see the embassy from where the actual embassy is. And at that point, things began to be very dangerous, and the government was alarmed. Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi himself intervened, and in fact gave those who organized the protest and the siege of the US Embassy a choice between moving away or he would walk out of the job and leave them in even bigger quagmire than they were in, because that meant the president will be the prime minister and the president, and then it will really end the sort of consensus building that is going on, the sharing of power among all the three major components of the Iraqi political power. And they listened and positively responded and withdrew, with the understanding that the prime minister gave his own assurances to everyone that he would handle this politically. Lo and behold, you had the attack near Baghdad airport that killed an Iranian general, General Qasem Soleimani, and the second man in the popular mobilization units in Iraq, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Both of them are on the United States list of terrorism, but also it is different than the other people who were on the list that were killed by the United States in the past, because there is a difference in the view of these people between the United States and the host countries. It's one thing to go after someone like bin Laden or Baghdadi, where everybody is after him, or someone like General Soleimani or Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, as we saw from the aftermath, the kind of reactions in Iran, in Iraq. So that was not a consensus building moment, let's put it that way, and it led to putting Iraq in the eye of the storm in a battle that was a US-Iranian battle, and Iraq is not necessarily officially part of it, even though Iraq is in a way involved. But the Iraqi government has been making painful efforts from the previous government, even with Dr. Abadi's government, and Adil Abdul Mahdi followed on it. They decided to take a neutral policy in all of the conflicts in the region. They did not want to be in a political camp. They opened relations with other neighbors like Saudi Arabia, like the rest of the Gulf, and as well as with Iran, improved their relations with Turkey, tried to be somehow a positive actor in the region without having to be in one camp or against another. And that kind of really did not hold well in this incident. And the Iraqis, because it happened to be on their soil, they were under pressure from two allies. Both of them are realities. The United States has been the major ally, the one that changed the regime, and it is, as I always describe the United States as the midwife of all of the change and the democratization process in Iraq. And also the Iranians, who are or the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a geographic reality for as long as the two countries have existed. 1,400 kilometers of border, about $12 billion of trade exchange. Iraq's energy either comes from Iran in the form of electricity or fuel that will make the electricity Iraq produces possible. The United States acknowledges that, given many waivers to pass the sanctions on Iran. So there is a reality for the Iranian presence next to Iraq, and the Iraqi government had to choose now between the Iranians and the Americans, and then the third actor inside Iraq, and these are the armed groups. Some of them are closer to Iran than they are to the Iraqi government, and they are making demands that are Iranian demands, are also some of their own demands, because that's how they have been operating ever since they were created in different periods of recent Iraqi history. So where are we right now? We are with a situation where the Americans chose the Iraqi soil and Iraqi territory as an operation in complete, according to the Iraqi description, this is in complete violation of the terms and conditions of the presence of US forces. And the Iranians did the same, chose Iraq as a place for retaliation. Now the Iranians say that they did attack American base, but make no mistake about it, there is no American base in Iraq. All of the bases are Iraqi bases, and they host Iraqi and American troops and other troops. The United States left Iraq in 2011 officially handed to the Iraqis all of the bases, and they are Iraqi bases as we see them. The American troops are there of two kinds. Either they are people who are training the Iraqis on the weapons Iraq purchased as part of the contracts deal, and there are those who went to Iraq at the invitation of the Iraqi government to train the Iraqis, build their capacity, and also to fight terrorism. That is the status of the Iraqi forces. There is no permanent base, and there is no American base to begin with, and these troops are not there for any reason other than what I just stated. That is exactly what the Iraqi Constitution mandates in Article 8, and that is what is the US-Iraqi Strategic Framework Agreement stipulates, in that the US would not seek permanent bases, and it will not use the Iraqi soil for any activities other than what was agreed upon. To conclude with, going forward, the Iraqi government has asked the parliament actually voted to mandate that the government would ask the United States to leave, to take its troops out of Iraq. The Iraqi government is not interested in breaking the relations with the United States, and they are in fact reluctantly asking the US to pull certain parts of their troops because even recently, last year, Adel Abdul Mahdi, the prime minister, despite many efforts and many calls on him to ask the US to leave, he refused. And until now, they are, and in his statements, he said this is the best way for both countries because these troops are unable to defend themselves in Iraq. The number is only about 5,000 to 6,000. And we are not being trusted to be able to defend them or to protect them. So what is next? Either they will be in harm's way, or the United States will have to send more troops in to protect their troops. And that will make a bad situation even worse. So the easiest way is to get that. But it is not a hostile act from the Iraqi government to break the relations or to ask the United States to completely disengage from Iraq. People I speak with in the Iraqi cabinet, in fact, they are working very hard to save what they can save of these relations, and especially the main immediate task, which is saving the diplomatic relations. If we still have diplomatic relations with Iraq, the diplomats can bring in what is lost in the relations between the two countries, the military cooperation and the business cooperation. I don't see any possibility for positive military cooperation or business cooperation between Iraq and the United States for the short term or probably even the middle term. But diplomatic relations, with a lot of diligence, a lot of effort, they can bring that back after this storm passes. If we lose the diplomatic relations right now because of escalation, because the United States takes offense that Iraq is choosing Iran over the United States, then it will be very hard to gain back what has been lost in the past few weeks. I'm a historian, and historically in US-Iraqi relations, every major event that happened in Iraq, it happened when there was no US ambassador in Iraq, or the embassy, the relations were broken. It always took 10 years or more every time the relations are broken to bring them back. And that would be very hard for Iraq and the United States to risk right now. The United States needs Iraq, and Iraq needs the US, but Iraq needs the US more, in fact. And I think we need to see both countries work hard to bring back robust relations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Barbara?
Well, first I want to express my condolences to the families of those who died on that Ukrainian airliner. There are reports now that apparently it was shot down by mistake by Iran. And this brought to mind for me the shoot down of the Iran Air Flight 655. All 290 on board was shot down by the Vincennes, an American Navy ship, which mistook it for a hostile plane. We are in a tragic situation where innocent people are already dying. where the prospects for escalation, as Tom has outlined, are very clear and very frightening. And the problem is that it's difficult to see a way out of this, certainly a diplomatic way out of this at this point. One hope we have is the European Union. It's meeting tomorrow. Emergency summit. They're going to talk about ways to try to work with Iran and work with the United States to somehow de-escalate. Russia has an interesting role to play, perhaps China. I'm not sure Russia wants this crisis to go away, or China either, since they're both benefiting enormously from this increase in tensions between the United States and Iran. President of the United States gave a speech in which he indicated that peace was his goal. If that is the case, we're going to need some steps toward that, which would require agreeing most likely to multilateral diplomacy, because Iran will not sit down with the United States bilaterally for a very long time, if at all under the Trump administration. But I think the Iranians have made clear that some sort of multilateral process is possible as a way to try to de-escalate. It's very unfortunate that the Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, was denied a visa to come to the United Nations. He was supposed to be here this week. I was supposed to be going up among a number of other think tankers to see him tomorrow. The State Department said that he asked too late for his visa. I thought that was a rather transparently incorrect remark. But there's talk about maybe having a UN meeting in Geneva. Reminds me when Yasser Arafat was denied a visa to come to the United States. He actually wanted to renounce terrorism at the time, and so they held the meeting in Geneva so that Yasser Arafat could say these things. Iranians don't want war. Americans don't want war. We ought to be able to figure out a way to scale this back. And you know, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was frankly a shocking act, and I have written rather pessimistically about what the likely consequences are. But you know, sometimes a shock can bring back a patient from a heart attack, and U.S.-Iran relations lately have certainly seemed like a continuing heart attack. So one can hope that there is some prospect out of it. Otherwise, as Tom suggested, we're going to have continued tension, continued acts covertly and otherwise by Iran, by its proxies, against American targets. I don't think they will go against civilian targets. I think they've been pretty clear about that, but there are plenty of military targets. There are, 70,000 American troops still in the Middle East. The Trump administration has sent an additional 17,000 just since May. So there are plenty of military targets, and the missile strikes that were carried out by the Iranians in retaliation for the assassination of General Soleimani told me that the Iranians were sending the message that we can hit you if we want. They told the Iraqis they were going to attack, and so everybody, of course, went and took shelter. The Iraqis told the United States. But we can't count on that kind of restraint going forward, especially if this continues to escalate. So I would hope that people in the State Department are actually looking for off-ramps now, talking to our European allies about ways we can find these off-ramps if they exist, considering whether there might be some sanctions relief that could be offered as an incentive to get Iran to the table. If the United States does not offer sanctions relief, Iran will not come to the table, and this situation will remain as it is or get worse over the next 9-10 months.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of asking the first question. I ask you all to be brief in your answers so that we can have time for everyone to come in. But my question is, let's just pause it for a moment, that Iran, the signal that Iran was trying to send by their rocket strike that did not kill anybody, is a desire for de-escalation so that they can focus on achieving their political objective, which is to get the United States to leave Iraq, which would then most likely require the United States to leave Syria as well. Let's for the moment. And therefore, they are not going to, during that period, exacerbate, cause problems for their own strategy by doing the kinds of kinetic activities that we've seen against tankers in the Gulf, against Saudi oil facilities, against U.S. facilities on Iraqi bases. What would they do to raise the likelihood of their success in the Iraqi political system? Would it be purely working through their proxies, and allies through the political system, or would they do other things on the street that we should be looking for to further tie the hands of our friends in Iraq who want to keep our relationship? What should we expect? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I think Abbas probably is best placed, but there are already rockets. there were rockets last night falling in the green zone again, so Iran has not stopped. Its proxies have not stopped their efforts to get the United States out of that country. And also we had the incident of this letter which said the U.S. was redeploying out of Iraq, which was then denied by the Pentagon. So maybe Abbas knows, is there any clarity in Baghdad about whether the U.S. is coming or going?
Well, there is no clarity because, as you mentioned, this letter was disputed. The Prime Minister said he received an official letter, and then they noticed that there was a difference between the Arabic and the English versions. So it's not, in his words, it's not a letter that fell off the Xerox machine and somebody found it. It was sent to them. And then when they found that discrepancy, they asked the Americans, and the Americans, and these are again the reporting is from what the Prime Minister said, the Americans sent them another version, and now they had Arabic and English corresponding to one another perfectly. Then the US said, oops, we don't really know what this letter is all about. So until we figure out what this letter was about, who sent it, whether it's the true intention or not. Also in Kuwait, there was this question that some of the troops were going actually to Kuwait, and the Kuwaiti news agency put it out, and then later on they found that it wasn't fully authorized, so they pulled it. And now the Kuwaitis don't know whether this was an authentic or some mistake. But be that as it may, I think the Iraqi government has already, the parliament is on the record, asked for the pullout. The Iraqi prime minister, in fact, is on board. You don't need the Iraqi parliament. All you need is the Iraqi prime minister. But because he's a caretaker, hasn't resigned, he wanted to create a consensus rather than be viewed as someone who wanted to act unilaterally. The prime minister switched in his position 180 degrees from someone who did not want. An Iraqi cabinet member told me in May 2019, just a few months ago, that Adil Abdul Mahdi was willing to turn in his resignation before he resigned for another reason, than ask the US to leave, to take their troops out. Now he went to the parliament and said there are two scenarios. One is a long-term pull out, so you give the US some time to pull out, and another is immediate, and he said I prefer the immediate one. So he is really most hawkish on how to get them out. Not out of, again, hostility to the US, but he fears every moment that there is a disaster that could happen. A rocket falls in and kills Americans or something else, and Iraq will be the battleground, and we've seen. So that's what we have seen in this. And I think the proxies are going to be there because let's remember that the attack that killed Soleimani killed also their leader. And they already made it clear that the Iranians retaliated for their own guy, and we are yet to retaliate for our own. That's what the head of Asa'ib al-Haq said, and we are waiting for the other shoe to drop, so to speak.
The thing, Will, that worries me the most is that Iran may choose not to do things militarily, but they will certainly ramp up their covert influence inside of Iraq. There have been reports already of efforts to intimidate Iraqi politicians in order to try to get a quorum in the Council of Representatives on Sunday. They may try other means to intimidate the selection of the next prime minister. so that they get a candidate more to their liking, but that would not be acceptable to the Iraqi street. This is a situation where there is relatively little that the United States can or should do, but I would be very concerned for Iraqi democracy being put in enormous jeopardy if Iran is able to intimidate its way into taking power in Baghdad, because I could see the reaction from other communities, from Erbil, from Kurdistan, from Anbar, are not going to accept this kind of Iranian intimidation, and this was in fact what the protesters were most concerned about. So I would hope that Iran does not feel as though it has a free hand to resume these anti-democratic tactics.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to questions. I'm going to start on this side and then move over. Why don't we start with you first, sir? Yeah, here's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Voice of America, Russian Service. My question is to anyone who would be willing to answer. What Russia and Turkey are gaining from this latest development? Who's gaining what? And what was your reaction to joint statement of Putin and Erdogan blaming the United States for escalating the situation, while NATO was rather supporting United States, and Turkey was the only country which actually publicly accused Washington in improper actions? Thank you.
I'll take a stab, maybe. The Russians are enjoying this enormously, and one of the consequences of this continuing tension in the region has been that we've seen Iran, Russia, and China, the three of them coordinate. They recently had maritime maneuvers. First time that all three countries have done that together. And I think we've seen some statements also from the Chinese suggesting that perhaps they are in a better position to provide security for the Persian Gulf than the United States. I think in addition, Iran's goal, yes, get the American troops out of Iraq, but also generally get the US out of the region, find other security arrangements which would not have the Americans in charge. So I would expect to see a lot more of this from both the Russians and the Chinese. Erdogan plays all sides against the middle. I mean, he's trying to keep a toehold somehow in NATO, but he hasn't acted very much like a NATO ally lately.
Anyone else?
I think we're on.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intel analyst and a former diplomat. Big picture question. Does it seem now that assassination of a bad guy, no matter how bad he is off the table if there's a state backer to that guy?
U.S. policy towards taking out terrorist actors and military targets has been clear for years, and so I would imagine that there would be, the usual careful review, the usual lawyer's analysis. This is why I have to say I regarded the idea of cultural sites being targeted as something of simply a provocative statement, not any kind of criminal intent, because I know that the review of military targets done within the Pentagon ensures that targets are chosen that are lawful and appropriate and in accordance with the laws of war, or they never make it out of the building. And so I think those procedures will continue, and the professionals inside the Defense Department will continue to do their jobs the way they're supposed to.
Just one thing about it. We will hear from two members of Congress to give what the United States sort of consensus or lack thereof on this one. But I think from the Iraqi perspective, the Iraqis were more sort of in a bad situation because it occurred on their own territory. And both attacks. So from trying to make stronger relations with the US and with Iran, they ended up being forced by their pressures from inside and by their law to condemn both the United States, their allies, the United States ally and the Iranian ally, for violating their sovereignty, as the Iraqis put it. So it's being conducted for both attacks on Iraqi soil, kind of made it different than just going and taking an act if it were in the country that you have a problem with. That's important to remember.
And just from my 2 cents before I go to the next question, any president will always have the need to have all the options when there's an actual imminent threat. I would note, though, that when President Trump spoke yesterday, and he read from a carefully prepared remarks off of a teleprompter, they didn't use the word imminent in that talk, which is perhaps of importance. Sir. Okay.
Based on 3 million years of Homo sapien existence, it's quite obvious that when you reach an inconcilable difference, that eventually that leads to a inevitable confrontation. Is there any doubt in the mind of the panel that we are really in a collision course with Iran, and all we're doing is just kicking the can down the road? And besides, a war is really another form of negotiation. It's just a little bit more physical.
What's had something to say along those lines. It is not inevitable that the differences between Iran and the United States need to lead to war. Even the Cold War was managed and eventually resolved without a major war between nuclear powers. I think one of the things that is going to happen is finding ways. Ironically, social media has turned out to be one of those ways. Who would have thought 10 years ago that we would have the United States president and the Iranian president tweeting back and forth at each other? So it's ironic that ways are found, channels are created. There are more back channels between the U.S. and Iran than there are people in this room. So I suspect that there will be an effort, and I hope that this conflict can be resolved through peaceful means.
Can I just add that the United States is already, in a sense, at war with Iran because it has been trying to prevent Iran from selling any oil since last May, which is an act of war, and certainly an act of economic war. So
I would disagree with that. That's fair.
So we are in effect in it already. But no, it's not inevitable. Look, we had an agreement that was reached under the previous administration, which certainly didn't make Iran into a friend, but it reduced the hostility. And I saw some figures recently that even the incidents in the region that are such a source of aggravation went down after the JCPOA was reached rather dramatically. So when the administration says that Iran continued its malign behavior, actually a lot of this was reduced when the JCPOA was reached. And we need to find a way to give Iran an incentive to return to negotiations and to scale back in all of these areas.
Why don't we get the lady up front?
I'm Faye Mokhtar. I'm a member of Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for this amazing program and amazing panel. I have a question for Dr. Karim. Iranians are there. Obviously, they claim that they have a national interest there, and the United States is there also because they have a national interest there. And at one point, their both national interests coincided with one another, and they were at a certain point helping each other. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, and if there is a way in the future we can find that mutual point? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are right. Most of the process from 2003 all the way had been more about cooperation on many important things in Iraq than else, and I will cite a few. But it's true that they had cooperated and they wanted the same thing in Iraq because the goals were mutual, even though for different reasons. And same thing happened in Afghanistan. You know, the United States did Iran a great favor by removing Saddam Hussein, who fought Iran for 8 years and then continued to be perceived as a hostile dictator, president, you name it, and from an Iranian perspective, an enemy. Then also, the Iranians were the first to recognize the new Iraqi state. Of course, because their friends were having a saying in Iraq for the first time. Both of them wanted an Iraq that is stable. Iran's goal in Iraq was to have Iraq that is stable, that is holding together, but not strong enough to be an enemy. And that is an issue for Iran that is important. The United States wanted Iraq to be stable and holding together. The Iranians helped Kurdistan, that is very close to the United States, the Kurdistan regional government. The greatest cooperation between the two, in fact, there was even interoperability in the defeat of ISIS. The Iranians were very much involved in it. That you cannot say about anything of that about the closer U.S. allies in the region. The Saudis did not recognize. In fact, they did everything to undermine the process until a couple of years ago when they had a change of heart. Same thing with other. Assad in Syria was one of the people who did everything to hinder the Iraqi government and the Iraqi process. In the beginning, in fact, as a proxy of the Gulfis, and later on for his own. The Turks were kind of freely doing, the thing and its opposite, as Barbara mentioned. So there was a lot of cooperation between the two because the goals were similar, even though the rationale behind the cooperation was different. Everybody saw, and they agreed to have sort of spheres of influence, to leave each other a little room. That's why what happened last week is very significant, because it changed the rules of engagement between Iran and the United States on the Iraqi soil. And who knows what the new rules are, whether they go back to the old rules or they will have to craft new rules. And the Iraqi government, and everybody in charge in Iraq is pulling their hair right now, trying to figure out what will happen so they can cope with it.
Mm-hmm. Sir, right behind.
Thank you. So I've been talking to a lot of Iranians inside the country, and there's a widespread rumor that the assassination of General Soleimani was rather an inside job to protect the state. And I'm not talking, I know that the Iranians love to spread rumors, but some people are saying that after the protests of last month, he was sacrificed to bring the people together as, people go vote. And some people are saying that he was sacrificed to basically facilitate a negotiation with the United States. Now, my question is whether anyone would agree with such rumors. And I emphasize, this is a widespread rumor in Iran.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not surprised, Sina. I'm not surprised, and I shouldn't laugh, no. I'm not surprised that such a rumor would spread, but it is clearly not the case. The President of the United States has been spiking the football ever since this happened. So no, the U.S. did indeed incinerate General Soleimani along with a number of others. However, you do raise an important point, and that is that there were widespread demonstrations in Iran against the government, and this crisis between the United States and Iran has essentially put the Iranian civil society movement in the deep freezer for the foreseeable future. The country is in lockdown now. You saw the people who came out to mourn Soleimani, and I think that was a genuine nationalistic outpouring. 40 days after his death, the 40-day period of mourning in Shiism, we have the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, when the regime typically struggles to get people out in the streets to chant death to America. I mean, they have to bus them in to Azadi Square and give them free lunch, normally, to get them to chant these slogans. They're not going to have any problem getting huge crowds, again, because while some Iranians may think it's great that General Soleimani is gone, others believe it was an outrage. For many, he was a national hero, and the government will have an easy time getting crowds. Plus, we have parliamentary elections coming up in Iran in February, and we have presidential elections next year, and the so-called hardliners who hate the United States, who did not like the JCPOA, who feel vindicated by the Trump administration's withdrawal from it. These are the forces that are on the ascendancy now and will be stronger than ever. That's another consequence of this tension, unfortunately, between the U.S. and Iran.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. Why don't we go way in the back to the lady standing up? Oh, far in the back, all the way in the back.
Alicia Dressman, independent consultant. So I'm hearing two versions of Iran here. One, an Iran that can launch low intensity, medium to high impact cyber offensive operations, very sophisticated, disruptive operations, etc., which require methodology and organization, and then one in Iran that needs off-ramps immediately because they might lose control, they might lose that strategic restraint, etc. So I want kind of in the middle, what, if you could characterize the event where Iran would feel that they would need to act in a way that we haven't seen before in response to what's been happening, what would that event look like? What would be the trigger, either from regional actors or the United States? What would we be seeing, etc.? Thank you.
Maybe for you, Tom, but just briefly, I didn't say they need an immediate off-ramp. I mean, an off-ramp would be great in terms of de-escalation of tensions in the region, but Iran will hang tough if need be, certainly until our elections. So don't misconstrue what I said.
And I would say that Iran is going to continue to pursue its strategy of trying to drive the United States out of Iraq. One of the things that greatly concerns me is that Iran is relying way too much on luck. It was the grace of God that no one was killed when they fired as many surface-to-surface rockets or missiles, excuse me, against the two Iraqi air bases, Al-Assad and Erbil. It's a huge mistake to rely on luck to save your country from a major and devastating military response, which would have been the case had someone simply decided to go out to retrieve an item in their tent. And that kind of action is as dangerous as anything else that I've heard criticized from any party in this dispute. It really does call for restraint upon all sides to understand that in the case of Iran, that their long-term national interest is in working out an arrangement that benefits them but does not expose them to greater risk, which it's very clear President Trump is prepared to visit upon the Iranians. That much is very clear.
And if I may say something also, something that happened in the last week that is important to put in the Iranian characterization in perspective. There is a lot of literature that describes Iran here and other places. Here, I mean, in Washington, is that there are people who go all the way from the spectrum, end of spectrum, that says Iran is an irrational, apocalyptic, country that just, all you need to do is to light a fuse and then the whole world will go in flames. And the other that says it is a calculated country that knows how to deliberate and how to act as a state actor. But nobody really had any evidence on how Iran would respond in case of a provocation or in case of really a true crisis. This was a true crisis that now gives us really an idea of how Iran would react when something like this happens. And I think any calculation on predicting how Iran will work, no matter what the reason why you need to figure out what Iran will look like in a crisis, this is it. We saw how Iran acted, and we saw what kind of reaction we expect from Iran in the future incidents. We hope there are no future incidents, but don't hold your breath on that.
And I'll just say at the end, before we're going to transition to the next part of our agenda, Iran will continue to act, obviously, as long as Iran finds it in its interest to do so. What the administration has done is establish one red line, which is the death of an American. And it has also established that it is willing to go to great length to ensure that they have escalation dominance in the reaction to such a circumstance. Those are not small, accomplishments. It's frankly something that the administration hadn't done previously. It leaves out a whole bunch of targets that are of interest to the United States that are not about the killing of an American. And it still remains to be seen about what the status of our deterrence is for those circumstances. Anyway, with that, let me apologize for cutting this part of it a little bit short and say thank you very much to the panel right here. Really appreciate it. And if I could ask once again everyone to stay in their seats, please, as we change.
Terrific. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this conversation today, and I want to welcome all of you who are in the room, for remaining, for our members of Congress who have joined, as well as all of those following us online. I want to remind everybody to use the hashtag #ACIran, #ACIraq. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I couldn't be more pleased than to welcome Senator Chris Murphy, Congressman Seth Moulton, to join us for an important conversation about the U.S.-Iran crisis, implications for Iraq, the region, and our strategy. As you've been watching, and as the panel before just laid out, the new year brought with it a pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy. U.S.-Iran tensions escalated to the point that it seemed we could have been on the path towards war. And while this dispute is far from resolved, it does look as though we may have walked back from the brink. But the recent crisis presents some important foreign policy questions that we're going to build on this first conversation to discuss in just a few minutes. In particular, the U.S. drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani near Baghdad airport last week has raised concerns about further retaliation from Iran and other impacts likely to be seen in the region and throughout the world. We know for certain that the recent events present complications for U.S.-Iraq relations, as you've just discussed, as we saw over the weekend with the parliament taking perhaps an initial step to expel U.S. troops. So following Iran's missile strikes on Tuesday on Iraqi bases that house American troops, there were thankfully no casualties on the American and Iraqi sides, and we've seen President Trump announce that new sanctions will be posed on Iran, but expressly did not express a desire to escalate further with military action. But questions remain about broader U.S. strategy, something we will discuss today. The Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative and Future of Iran Initiative are honored to host Congressman Seth Moulton and Senator Chris Murphy, who will share their views on these critical issues as well as the role of Congress. And after I introduce our speakers, they will each provide short opening remarks from the podium and then join me on stage for a conversation. We'll invite you to be part of that. Congressman Seth Moulton has served as the representative for Massachusetts' 6th Congressional District since 2015, as the co-chair of the House Iraq Caucus. After graduating from Harvard University with a degree in physics, he joined the United States Marine Corps. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, he led one of the first infantry platoons into Baghdad. He served a total of 4 tours of duty in Iraq. He was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for Valor, as well as the Bronze Star Medal. Following his military service, he went on to continue his education at Harvard and entered politics in 2014, running for Massachusetts' 6th Congressional District, which he represents. He's been an outspoken voice in the House on these issues, and we look forward to hearing from you in just a minute. He will be followed by Senator Chris Murphy, who has served as a senator from Connecticut since 2013. Senator Murphy also previously served in the House of Representatives representing Connecticut's 5th Congressional District. He's a prominent member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and Counterterrorism, and he's been an outspoken leader on U.S. foreign policy globally, as well as a frequent visitor to Iraq and other key Middle Eastern countries and a close partner of the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted that we have them in the House to continue this conversation today. They've broken away from very important votes up on Capitol Hill, which will take them back to the Hill after this. But with that, let me invite Congressman Moulton to the podium for some opening remarks.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for hosting me again. I was last here on February 2nd, 2016, nearly 4 years ago to the day, and 9 months before we had to contemplate the reality of how Donald Trump would act as Commander-in-Chief. I devoted a large part of that speech in 2016 to the general optimism I had in the Iran deal, though I knew it needed continued positive reinforcement, and to the idea that American foreign policy with regard to Iran and our larger role in the world should be founded on the principle that guided my unit in the Marines, that there is no better friend and no worse enemy than the United States of America. So much has changed since 2016. Today, we find ourselves closer to war with Iran than at any point in my lifetime. We did not get here overnight, and while I could give a dissertation on what led us here, I will only recount briefly the history that followed the last time I joined you in 2016. When President Trump took office, he used his inaugural address to promise an end to American carnage. Yet from the moment he arrived in the Oval Office, President Trump has put America on the path toward more American carnage in the Middle East, through less diplomacy and more conflict. It started when Rex Tillerson gutted the State Department. During his 1 year and 1 month tenure, 60% of top-ranking career diplomats at the State Department resigned, and new applications to join the Foreign Service fell by half. As of Saturday, more than 1 out of every 5 positions at the State Department remain unfilled. 6 people have filled the job of National Security Advisor. The most notable among them include Michael Flynn, whom the Justice Department recommended this week should go to jail for 6 months for lying about colluding with Russia against America's interests. Our National Security Advisor. And John Bolton, whose foreign policy principles sent me and thousands of others to Iraq. There are, of course, some people the President appointed to serve the country who have done so honorably, many serving at the Pentagon and the State Department. Jim Mattis, whom I proudly served under in the Marines, resigned rather than let the President abandon our allies in Syria. Richard Spencer, the Secretary of the Navy and former acting Secretary of Defense, resigned rather than allow Eddie Gallagher, a war criminal, to keep his Navy SEAL insignia after the President pardoned him. And we heard from numerous senior diplomats during the impeachment hearings in the House about how hard they worked to continue supporting our partner Ukraine in its fight against Russia, despite President Trump's attempts to use foreign countries to influence America's elections. These are small vignettes of the chaos that brought us to today, where a weak, reckless commander-in-chief who dodged the draft for his generation's war can't seem to temper his impulses to start a new one. America's foreign policy is rudderless. Small decisions, like the impulsive one to relocate the American embassy in Israel, and large ones, like the decision to exchange photo ops with Kim Jong-un for nothing, or to abandon our Kurdish allies in the fight against ISIS in Syria. These decisions have endangered our troops and diplomats and made America less safe. Under President Trump, we have become literally the laughingstock of our allies. Iran is the most recent calamity. During yesterday's brief to the House of Representatives, Secretaries Esper and Pompeo each listed the administration's 3 policy goals for Iran. So before debating whether their Iran policy is correct, let's just measure their success against their own stated goals. First, the administration says it wants to deter Iran's regional aggression. Yet since the Trump administration ratcheted up the pressure with Iran, including by withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, regional tensions have only gotten worse. Iran has downed an American drone, captured British oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, and blown up Saudi Arabia's largest oil field. The kinds of actions the regime in Tehran never undertook when the deal was in effect. Second, the administration says it wants to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But Iran announced this week that they will no longer adhere to any of the restrictions in the Iran nuclear deal. Third, the administration says it wants to continue the fight against terrorism in the Middle East. Yet the military just called off our counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq in order to hunker down for imminent Iranian retaliation for the president's strike. Fourth, the administration says it wants to establish a strong and independent Iraq, yet they've dramatically weakened a diplomatic presence that I told the administration Obama was too weak, the Obama administration was too weak to begin with. And Iran's influence over Iraqi politics has only grown. In fact, it grew so much that Iraqis started taking to the streets to protest Iran's meddling and push them out, which is exactly what we want. But overnight, the president reversed that fortunate turn of events and united many in the Iraqi parliament around kicking us out, not Iran. The one thing worse than starting an unnecessary war in Iraq is starting an unnecessary war in Iraq that Iran wins. Finally, the administration says it wants to bring Iran to the negotiating table. Iran was actually at the negotiating table because of the Iran deal. Now they've never been further away. And why would Iran even bother to negotiate a new deal for themselves when Trump has shown that America's word is meaningless and the next administration, if not his own, could simply tear it up? In summary, on every one of the administration's own measures, their maximum pressure campaign has been a maximum failure. I'll point out one more thing. You might have noticed that I prefaced this list by saying that both Secretaries Pompeo and Esper gave us their 3 policy goals on Iran. But there were 5 things on my list. They were sitting right next to each other yesterday, our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense, and they didn't even agree on the top 3 policy goals for Iran. Iran is a serious, sophisticated adversary of the United States who has killed Americans and wants to kill more. We need a serious, comprehensive strategy to succeed, and yet top administration officials aren't even speaking the same language. Some will say that all of these policy goals are subservient to the real, unacknowledged goal of Secretary Pompeo, regime change. So let's go with that for a second. Explain to me how any of this, how any of the administration's actions bring about a more moderate regime. The only glimmer of hope we saw was 2 weeks ago when Qasem Soleimani, leader in spirit and practice of Iran's hardliners, faced serious backlash in Iranian public opinion over massacring hundreds of Iranian protesters. This was just 2 weeks ago. In the short time since, President Trump has succeeded in making him a martyr. The Iranian threat is deadly serious. I have fought Iranians and Iranian proxies on the ground in Iraq. Qasem Soleimani is evil, with American blood on his hands. We need to be smart and we need to be strategic to meet this threat. Today, Iran is more aggressive, its hardliners more emboldened, its country more united than when President Trump took office. By every indicator, President Trump's decision to make the strike was impulsive. The only people briefed ahead of time were the president's golfing buddies like Senator Lindsey Graham, not the Gang of Eight, not Speaker Pelosi or Majority Leader McConnell. Some reports have said the military only presented this assassination as a quote-unquote crazy option, designed to play the role of outlier to push the president to make a wiser decision. To the surprise of many at the Pentagon, the president was foolish enough to pick it. In the aftermath, Vice President Pence tried to justify this action by saying that Soleimani helped the 9/11 hijackers, a statement that is completely false. Others have said to simply be happy that Qasem Soleimani is dead. I am happy that he's dead. I do not mourn for this man who was directly responsible for some 600 American deaths in Iraq, a few of whom were my friends. But this is not that simple. It was telling that every one of my fellow veterans who texted me that night, the night he was killed, of all those texts, not one of them celebrated his death, although they too, I am sure, would rather him dead than alive. What they said was, what the hell are we doing? And is there a plan for what comes next? Sadly, as I told them that night, I've seen no evidence that there is. The decision to kill him reminds me of a decision I faced when General Petraeus sent my small team of Marines and me down to a southern Iraqi city in 2005 to wrest control of the city from a militia. There was a Soleimani-like figure in charge, an evil governor who was an Iranian proxy. And trust me, I wanted to see him dead. But we made a strategic decision not to take him out because we thought it would create more problems, more unrest, more insurgents, more terrorists than it would solve. That's always the calculation you undertake in counterterrorism. Are you killing more terrorists than you are creating? If there is intelligence that shows this strike presented a new and imminent threat to Americans, I have yet to see it. That's why Republicans Mike Lee and Rand Paul announced their support for the War Powers Resolution the House is voting on later today. And it's why I am reiterating my call today for the administration to declassify the legal notification President Trump sent to Congress so that every American knows what this threat was and what it was not. I fought in a war a president started because of cooked and false intelligence. We cannot let this administration repeat that mistake. And while I don't trust Iran's leaders, I do trust their promise to retaliate. And anyone who believes the zero casualty ballistic missile strikes are the end of it doesn't understand Iran at all. Another way to put what those veteran buddies of mine texted me the other night is, what comes next? I don't believe the administration seriously grappled with that question before taking the strike, but we all must now. The president lacks a vision for policy with Iran, but here's one. We need to be very clear about what our national interests are. First, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Imagine where we'd be today if the president put all this effort into strengthening and lengthening the deal rather than tearing it up. We need to reignite the diplomatic effort to get that going. As difficult as that is today, there is no better way forward. Second, we must counter and truly deter Iran's malign activities in the region. We can do that through clearly, smartly targeted unilateral and multilateral sanctions, by building systems to help our partners in the region protect themselves, by undertaking cyber activities to hamper Iran's efforts, by supporting political and military forces in the region who are fighting against Iranian influence, and by responding quickly and proportionately to Iran's actions like shooting down our drone. In Iraq, we must eventually come to an agreement with the government about how we can continue taking the fight to ISIS. We need to strengthen our political relationship with their leaders so that we have some leverage and influence as they navigate this difficult issue. And we need to restore the diplomatic complement of the Baghdad Embassy, which receives far less incoming fire today than it did during the height of the war a decade ago when we had hundreds of diplomats there. The president has said he wants to end the forever wars around the world, but he just sent thousands more troops to Kuwait. He understands the domestic political benefit of ending wars, but there is a critical strategic reason as well. I've now spent 15 minutes speaking to a room full of some of the best national security experts in America, and I have not spoken a word about what Democrats and Republicans agree, and our administration's national defense strategy clearly states are the greatest threats to our country. Iran is a bad actor, but they are a mid-level power that does not pose an existential threat to the United States, and certainly doesn't compare to Russia's nuclear weapons and their efforts to undermine our democracy around the world, or the long-term economic and national security threat of a rising China. Not to mention the distraction that this self-inflicted escalation will be to the work we have to do on North Korea, a country that already has nuclear weapons. The Future Defense Task Force I co-chair received a fascinating and frightening brief on synthetic biology yesterday, emphasizing how critical it is for our national security for the next half century or more. And it's critical that we win that race against China. But we were probably the only ones talking about that on Capitol Hill yesterday. The Commander-in-Chief is clearly failing, so it is up to the rest of us. We must meet this moment by doing our duties as citizens in this great country. This is a moment for robust debate in Congress, here at the Atlantic Council, and at the kitchen table. The Marine and war reporter C.J. Chivers, in his haunting book, The Fighters, quotes a handwritten note scribbled on the wall of a government center in Iraq in 2007. "America is not at war," it said. "The Marine Corps is at war. America is at them all." As Congress and the country participate in a debate about what happens next with Iran, we need to keep this warning in the front of our minds. A very small number of Americans do the fighting when the United States goes to war today. And for those members of our military in the chain of command here in Washington and elsewhere, look very carefully at every order given to you by this president. It is our duty to make sure everything done in the name of the United States military is lawful, and that burden falls on us. This is also a moment for journalism that questions the leaders in this administration and compels Congress to do our job. We cannot repeat the same mistakes that led us to Iraq when some members of the press played an enabling role in the run-up to the war. This is also a moment for a new generation of leaders. Memes and tweets about World War III don't cut it. I spent 2018 supporting national security professionals in their runs for political office, and they helped the Democrats win a majority in the House. I did so because I believe that Congress will make better decisions about going to war if we have more members who actually have experience fighting war. I am proud and more confident to know that people like former CIA officer Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan delivered a forceful rebuttal of the Iran strike last week, and she's leading the House's War Powers resolution. I'm also proud to stand with people like Andy Kim and Jason Crow as members of the House Democrats' National Security Task Force. We need more leaders who are thinking seriously about what America's role in the world should be and have experience shaping it. And it's why I'm proud to be here with Senator Chris Murphy today. Too much of our country's foreign policy has been driven by inertia, from fighting the longest war in American history in Afghanistan to the idea that Iran is a 50-foot-tall behemoth that commands all our focus and attention. In this moment of crisis, we have an opportunity to break that inertia and to develop a new strategy for the Middle East. We have an opportunity to enforce the laws and constitutional responsibilities that have been ignored by multiple Congresses and multiple administrations on both sides of the aisle. We have an opportunity to call on our military officers around the world to bring new scrutiny to their sworn oath to obey lawful orders, and only lawful orders. Or we can just wait until things get a little worse. That is our choice. Senator Murphy.
Well, Damon, thank you very much for having both of us here today. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for constantly being a forum and a venue for both experts and policymakers to put our brains and minds together, especially at these very perilous and grave moments. I deliberately did not do prepared remarks because I knew that Seth Moulton was going to cover the waterfront as he did, and let me most importantly associate myself with, I think, an excellent set of remarks from Seth regarding the unnecessary escalatory lead up to this moment and the ill-thought-out decision to take a step, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, that none of us lament, though we all note it was available to prior administrations. They chose differently for a reason. And so let me, before we sit down for a conversation, just try to fill in a few of the areas that maybe deserve to be covered a bit more. And so I'm just going to try to very quickly cover 4 or 5 areas and then sit down for a conversation. First, let me underscore maybe the most important point that Congressman Moulton made, that this entire escalatory lead up to the moment of crisis that we find ourselves in today was all an exercise of choice. Now, we all committed ourselves after the debacle and mistake of the Iraq War that we would never, ever again send our brave men and women into a war that we could avoid. And yet, we have come perilously close, and I would argue are still perilously close to making that same mistake again. And so it is important for us to go back over the last 2.5 years and understand how we got here. And I think there are 2 important takeaways that aren't always talked about on the first and second page of analyses about the first 3 years of the Trump presidency and his bizarre, backwards, nonsensical policy towards Iran. And the first is this. Many people looked at Iran's response to a series of economic sanctions as asymmetric. Right? For many people, it didn't make sense that Iran was requisitioning tankers and was shooting at Saudi oil refineries in response to what, from our side, looked like a series of deliberately non-kinetic economic sanctions. There's no way to justify any of the escalatory steps that Iran took, but you have to understand how they viewed our actions. They viewed our sanctions, which were debilitating in their scope, as an effort to strip away Iran's access from the international oil market, right? Without access to that oil market, Iran as an economy cannot function, and the regime all of a sudden is in jeopardy. Now, Iran doesn't have the same economic capacity to do the same thing to the West, to Europe and to the United States. They cannot use economic tools in the way that America can to try to divorce their adversaries from the international oil market. And so they attempted to do so with the tools that they had available, which are by and large military and kinetic tools. Now, that does not explain or rationalize their actions, but it makes it look much more symmetric than it may seem to begin with. This was an escalatory choice by this administration to set in motion a series of crippling economic sanctions not supported by our allies, which we knew Iran could not stand idly by without some kind of reaction, and they had limited tools at their disposal to do so. Second, part of this escalation involved this administration's bizarre decision to make themselves a client state of Saudi Arabia. Right? The Iranians will tell you, and you have to take everything they tell you with a grain of salt, that their missiles, for now, aren't pointed at Israel. They're pointed at Saudi Arabia. And every time we sell more missiles to Saudi Arabia, every time that we grant them more unconditional, unquestioned support, it's a signal to the Iranians that they have to dig in more, that they have to build more, that they have to equip themselves more. And so if you want to have a comprehensive strategy to try to ultimately convince the Iranians to downgrade their malevolent behavior in the region or to reverse their investment in their ballistic missile program, then you cannot do what this Trump administration has done, which is to make this massive investment in the buildup of the Saudi military. And so that all leads us to this moment today. And I think, once again, Seth did a wonderful job of explaining the danger surrounding the choice that the administration made on Thursday night. But let me just make an additional comment about the intel that was made available to us, because I think this is an incredibly important discussion to have. Now, obviously, neither of us can disclose classified information that's been made available to us, but it is generally accepted that the administration, any administration, can engage in a military attack against a foreign power or a non-state actor without congressional authorization, so long as they can prove that that attack was imminent. All right. Now, that's not actually in the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act actually doesn't give you that exception, but it has generally been accepted that that is an ability for the administration to act without congressional authorization. I can tell you this with confidence. I can't speak for the briefing before the House, but in the briefing before the Senate, the administration provided no evidence of an imminent, immediate attack. Now, it's not enough to just suggest that the Iranians were planning an attack against the United States. The Iranians, especially today, are logically planning attacks against the United States, just as we are gaming our own potential attacks against Iran. But if the attack isn't imminent, if the attack isn't specific, then I believe the Constitution requires the administration to come to Congress to get that authorization ahead of time. And it was shocking and surprising to many of us yesterday to not see that intel provided to us. I don't believe it's because it doesn't exist. I don't believe it's because they weren't showing it to us. I believe it's because it doesn't exist. I believe this administration made a decision to kill Qasem Soleimani unconnected to the threat made against the United States, and are now trying to justify that decision through vague talk of an imminent threat that may not have existed. The reason why Congress is supposed to be involved in decisions of this consequence is because without the American people being able to weigh in, the downside to U.S. national security can be, as it has been for the last 6 days, catastrophic. Again, Seth did a great job of giving a quick recitation of how much weaker we are and how much stronger Iran is just in the last 6 days. I mean, it's really extraordinary just to think about what has happened in 1 week. The Iranians walking away from their commitments in the JCPOA, closer than ever before to being able to obtain a nuclear weapon. Our troops on the verge of being pushed out of Iraq, a gift to ISIS. Iran, just weeks ago, rallying against the regime, now wrapping its arms around it. And all of the Iraqi political infrastructure now agreed that the one sworn enemy is the United States of America. All this happening in 7 days is dizzying, but to know that it happened by choice is maddening as well. Lastly, let me just talk about Iraq. I spent some time on this morning, and I know you spent some time earlier in this session talking about the political situation on the ground there. I spent some time this morning talking to our ambassador there. This was the absolute worst time to empower Shia radicals inside Iraq. We have invested a paltry amount of money in helping Iraq rebuild from the consequences of destroying sections of that nation connected to the fight against ISIS. Over the course of the last several years, Iran has become more and more powerful. The Shia moderates have disappeared inside the parliament. ISIS has begun to regroup in parts of that country. And what we have done in executing Qasem Soleimani without any prior notification to the Iraqi regime on Iraqi civilian soil is to essentially gift to radical Shia political leaders in that country an ascendancy, and to set the stage for the kind of marginalization of Sunni, which was the entire story regarding the lead up and build up of ISIS. And so at the moment where we are likely going to be pushed in whole or in part out of that country, we are also creating these conditions for another cycle of Sunni marginalization, which is exactly what the lingering elements of ISIS need in order to mount a campaign of resurgence. So this is an incredibly dangerous moment, a moment that this administration chose to put America into. And I'm glad that Seth is going to be returning to the House to take a vote on a war powers resolution. That is a privileged motion in the United States Senate, and so we plan on bringing a similar measure before the Senate within the next several weeks. But I hope as we sit down, we will assert our congressional authority, but also understand our limitations. Congress doesn't manage the day-to-day foreign policy of this nation. And while we can authorize and defund actions abroad, the responsibility for the situation that we find ourselves in today, with Iran more powerful than when Trump took office and America weaker in the Middle East and in every part of the rest of the world, the responsibility for that set of events lies only at the feet of this president. We can do our best to try to make up for this recklessness, for this capriciousness, but there are limits even to our ability to do that kind of correction. So I'm very glad to be here with you today, eager to sit down for a conversation with Damon.
Thank you very much, Senator Murphy, Congressman Moulton. Appreciate your remarks here. Let me just state at the outset, you've both been to the Atlanta Council before, and you're usually both here with a member of the other party on stage with you. So I just want to reiterate, the Atlanta Council very much is a nonpartisan organization, and we fully plan to have Republicans join this conversation as well, but unfortunately they were not able to at the last minute. So let me pick this up with where Senator Murphy ended. You, Congressman Moulton, are headed back to the Hill after this to vote on the War Powers Act. Give us a sense of what the purpose of doing that vote now is for, and Senator Murphy, how you see the prospects of this and the Senate, given the political makeup of the Senate. You've already stated that you think the president is in violation of the Wars Power Act. What's the point of this exercise right now?
Well, first of all, I've been calling for this for a long time. And I mean, literally since I came to Congress, I've been talking about having a debate on the authorization for the use of military force in the Middle East. Representative Ro Khanna and I introduced an amendment to the defense bill this year on this specific issue, specifically with regards to Iran. We were told essentially that this is a contentious issue, let's not have that debate right now. Well, this is what we get. But it's never too late for Congress to exercise its constitutional responsibilities, and that's what we're doing today.
And Senator Murphy, to head to a Senate where the prospects are perhaps not as obvious as in the House.
You're right. I mean, I think there's a ability to get 50 votes in the United States Senate on this resolution. Unlikely that we will get enough to override a veto. But as one of the authors of the Yemen War Powers Resolution, along with Senator Sanders, I saw what forcing a debate in the Senate around the issue of Yemen did to pressure both the administration and our partners to change course and to change policy. We ultimately lost that fight over the Yemen War Powers Resolution. It passed the House and the Senate, was vetoed by the president. We weren't able to override it. But I would submit to you that you wouldn't be seeing some of the grass shoots of peace or ceasefire negotiations, nor the decision making on behalf of some of our allies in the region, like UAE, to pull themselves in part out of that conflict if it hadn't been for the debate that we forced. And so I just think, we have a, constitutional responsibility, regardless of the likelihood of success, to have these debates. But I also know that even in the absence of ultimate success, the debate itself can force policy change both in the administration and outside the United States.
So you both have made comments, I think Congressman Moulton, you said that what we do in this crisis, we need to figure out how to kill more terrorists than we create. And Senator Murphy, you've talked about the responsibility to prove that the strike prevented rather than inspired more attacks. It sounds like you can conclude from what you've just said that the briefing that you both have gotten, the separate briefings on Capitol Hill, have not, from the administration, have not satisfied that threshold in your mind. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think it's extraordinary that they haven't presented more comprehensive intel. My feeling is that is likely because it does not exist. And again, it's also extraordinary in such a short period of time that we've seen such a set of adverse consequences to U.S. national security, which I think proves out many of our early worries.
We don't know exactly how this decision was made, but if you just look at the sort of what we do know, there was clearly no groundwork laid with the Iraqis. There was no preparation even to evacuate our people from Iraq when we called for that immediately after the strike took place. There was no repositioning of American forces, even though that happened immediately thereafter. So there's a lot of evidence that points to this just being a very impulsive decision by the president that wasn't, frankly, thought through.
And the one claim that many of my colleagues in the Senate have made is that this, quote, restored deterrence, unquote. But at the same time, administration officials are claiming that the Iranians actually intended to kill dozens, perhaps 100 or more U.S. personnel in their attack 2 nights ago and simply missed. And so if that is the case, that was intended to be a lethal strike, then the targeting of Qasem Soleimani did not, in fact, restore deterrence at all. And so you kind of can't have it both ways. And the administration seems to be wanting to do exactly that.
Well, let me just ask, because much of the criticism in the immediate aftermath was focused on, is this pushing us to the inevitability towards war? And yet I think President Trump had made it pretty clear in his remarks that that's not where we are. Do you accept that this cycle is not, we're not trapped in a cycle of recriminations that could escalate now?
Well, yes. If there's one thing I've learned over the last several years, it's to trust everything President Trump says.
He says with a deadpan face.
I think we should remember that the night of the attacks, there were different messages coming from Zarif and the Supreme Leader. And we also know that the Iraqi-backed militias inside Iran operate at the broad direction and often the tactical direction of Tehran. But they also have independent decision-making, and there are raw feelings to the point that it's hard to describe in the United States that could lead to some independent decision-making over the course of the next few days inside Iraq that will have another set of spill-on consequences and another set of decisions for the United States to make.
Let me ask, sort of inverted. It's easy in some respects to react to what's happening, but if you inverse this and have the responsibility to figure out, we've seen in Iran that has attacked facilities in Saudi Arabia, that has attacked shipping in the Persian Gulf, that has been implicated in the deaths of Americans. What would you have done to help deter Iran from these activities, which did seem to be mounting? What course would you have taken?
Well, of course, I never would have gotten us in this position to begin with. I mean, we should have stayed in the JCPOA and strengthened it. Attacks like this were at a lull when that deal was in place. We should have given Iran a clear path to how they can change their behavior in exchange for lessening sanctions and becoming a part of the world community. Not only do we not know what our Iran strategy is, they don't know either. So I don't think they see a path out of this. They don't understand how this works. I mean, one of the things I've struggled with is this question about what Pompeo actually thinks he's going to get if there truly is regime change, because everything he's done is empowering the hardliners. So we have to lay out a path. But I will also say this, given where we got with the Trump administration's actions, I just gave a dissertation on why I don't think we should have taken out Qasem Soleimani, but I was also calling for a more forceful response to the drone strike. Because when Trump did nothing in response to that, it signaled to the Iranians, okay, I guess we can keep doing that. Maybe we'll take it a step further. So he's completely missed proportionality in both directions.
To include at the time what he was considering a strike on Iran?
I think I would have done something that wouldn't have killed Iranians, but would have been extremely clear and disruptive, and would have happened immediately in response to that strike. Like for example, using a cyber operation to cut off electricity to a part of the country where it came from. I mean, there are options on the table like that would have sent a clear and unambiguous message that if you mess with us, we're going to hit back, but not something that's totally out of proportion for what happened.
I just think it's extraordinary to think about the position that President Obama left President Trump in. President Obama, through great work and toil, had united the world against Iran and brought some unlikely partners into that coalition. Remember, at the end of the Obama administration, we have the United States, the EU, Russia, and China lined up against Iran on the JCPOA. Now, it was logical that we had to take a pause on a new set of crippling sanctions. It likely would have violated the spirit, though not the letter of the deal, had we gone right back to the table and put together a global coalition of new sanctions against them for a ballistic missile program or their support for terrorist groups. But the moment where that became ripe was essentially the moment when President Trump took office. And he could have chosen to take all of this goodwill and built up a new set of sanctions that could have achieved the same result on ballistic missiles as we did on the nuclear program. And instead, he set into motion this series of events in which something extraordinary happened. Almost overnight, it went from the United States, the EU, China, and Russia versus Iran to Iran, China, Russia, and the EU versus the United States. And that is hard to do, but it's always difficult to sort of ask us to sort of, what would you have done in the middle of the crisis that Trump created? Because to us, the real tragedy is that had he made different choices, it's not that we just wouldn't be in the crisis we're in today. We might actually have made, I would say, we likely would have made progress on a series of legitimate other complaints we have and have always had about Iran's malevolent behavior.
I just want to underline this point because it's an interesting comparison on leadership that the senator just made, which is that President Obama led all these countries into the Iran deal, right? When President Trump left, none of them followed. Just like President Obama brought all these nations together for the Paris Accord, when Trump pulled America out, nobody followed.
So let me come back to the issue of Iraq, which our team here and Steve Hadley, who's been working with us, very concerned about Iraq being instrumentalized through this crisis. Senator Murphy, you had warned even in advance of all of this unfolding, you had cautioned about the risk of U.S. troops being expelled from Iraq. Some out there are arguing, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing, and perhaps that might even be something that is in President Trump's mind that might not be where Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense agree. So how do you see the future of U.S. forces in Iraq? I mean, shouldn't we be drawing down with the defeat of ISIS at some point from a presence there?
Well, we should, and I think all of our constituents support a gradual and strategic withdrawal of American troops. But that should be done on terms that are consistent with U.S. and Iraqi security, not political terms that have been imposed by a catastrophic decision made by this president, upsetting the political dynamics of that country. And as I stated before, the reality is that ISIS has been able to partially regroup. The decision we made in Syria has compounded the errors we have made regarding anti-ISIS policy. And so, yes, we should be talking about an orderly withdrawal, but these are terms which are going to make that occur in emergency circumstances, side by side, with a set of political dynamics that will actually accrue to the benefit of Sunni extremists. And so that's why I talk about it as a perfect storm. At the very moment when the U.S. is being pushed out, a set of local political dynamics are being put in place that may provide the preconditions for the reemergence of ISIS.
The reason to leave Iraq is because we succeed in our policy goals there, not because Iran succeeds in pushing us out.
Let me ask you a question about the process that's unfolded, because I think there's been, and you've echoed some criticism of the president operating by the seat of his pants, as a way I think you phrased it at one point, and yet it's pretty clear that the president had demonstrated some hesitancy and caution on action with Iran in the past, declining to strike against as one of the options after the drone strike. And it's pretty clear that Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper went to Florida, took options, that Secretary Pompeo has been arguing for a more considered, tougher line here. How do you reconcile sort of the dichotomy between the president as an outlier operating on his own, and really what seems to be his national security team building up options, providing, perhaps encouraging a more robust action against Iran?
I think the national security team is trying to do its job. I don't agree with just about anything that Secretary Pompeo has done, but I think the national security team in general is probably trying to do their job. But impulsivity goes in both directions, and you can be impulsively dovish and impulsively hawkish. I think it's a mistake to try to reconstruct some strategy out of that in retrospect.
And Senator Murphy, the point on bigger picture strategy, you yourself have been quite a voice in the Senate on the challenge that we face from China, from Russia, from other places. And we heard Congressman Moulton make a point that Iran is essentially a nuisance. And how do we avoid the distraction of a conflict, a crisis in the Middle East, when we've got a national security strategy, we've got great power competition, we've got long-term challenges by a disruptive Russia today and a long-term challenge from China. How do you think about the relative balance of the threats that we're facing as a nation?
Well, listen, that asks for a 30-minute dissertation, which I won't give you, except to say that Iraq is also, and this crisis is a microcosm of the way in which we are so badly resourced to try to meet the challenges that we face. Right? We're only talking about kinetic responses. We're only talking about ways to manage crises through military response. And I would argue part of the reason why Iraq is so unstable today is that for the last 4 years in particular, we've been spending 4 times as much money equipping their military as we have been helping to try to rebuild places like Mosul, when in fact the real long-term danger to that country is the permanent infrastructure falling apart in places where Sunni extremists will take advantage. And so, my broader argument of the case here is that as we try to pivot ourselves to the real challenges that we face in the world, a 20-to-1 spending differential in terms of the money we're spending on the military and intel versus the money we spend on democracy promotion and human rights and economic development just doesn't fit the bill. And the misresource of spending in Iraq is part of the reason, I think, why that country is weaker than it should be. And our over-reliance on military tools is partially why today it's the only mechanism that we have to communicate with a country like Iran. And it ends up being a very blunt tool with which you can make some pretty serious mistakes.
Let me come to
this. Is such an important point. And imagine if all the money in the Marshall Plan was spent on training German troops. That's basically what we're doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan as well.
It's an interesting way to think about the challenge. So in this context of our allies, let me ask a question about that. And Senator Murphy has said before that our allies don't trust us, and yet the allies break a little bit on this set of issues. You have Arab allies, Israel, reacting one way, European allies another way. How do you think about keeping a broader set of a coalition, broader set of allies on board with what we're doing when they here are themselves are split?
Well, I think, our Arab allies, our Sunni Arab allies in the region have gotten so much from this administration, essentially carte blanche to, capture and chop up American residents, that they are not in a position to publicly object, though behind the scenes, I believe that they are deeply worried about the escalatory steps that could eventually pull them into a conflict. The reality is that, I don't think it's any secret that there were some beginnings of conversations quietly happening between the Iranians and the Saudis, and that this most recent crisis over the last several weeks has sort of put the ice on those conversations. And so while I think you will hear sort of public support from our Sunni Arab allies, I think that they are much more worried, frankly, than we are about the consequences of a long-term kinetic conflict in the region.
May I ask another question about allies, then I want to take just a couple before we close out from the audience. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, spoke to President Trump, I think yesterday, and in which they both put out statements and talked about interest in NATO playing more of a role, which took some people by surprise. What's your thought of we're here at the Atlantic Council, what NATO's role could be? What did you think of this set of issues, the idea that was floated by President Trump? Do you see any pathway there for the alliance to be more involved in a way that's constructive for our interest in the region?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that as someone who spent a lot of time on the ground fighting with NATO troops, specifically in southern Iraq, by the way, the types of places where Iran has its biggest influence, there's absolutely a role in partnership there. But more broadly, and I'll just leave it at this, more broadly, the issue with NATO today is that thanks to Trump's actions, but also thanks to just progress in the world, NATO is not as relevant as it used to be. We need to modernize NATO because NATO has not been effective at dealing with this new type of hybrid warfare, cyber attacks and whatnot that Russia is presenting. And that's really where our focus should be with NATO, I think.
You've seen two NATO allies begin the pullout from Iraq in the last 7 days. Notwithstanding the Secretary General's comments, I think it's rather unlikely that NATO is going to make a major new commitment to Iraq while President Trump is in office.
We have a few minutes. I want to take a few questions here. Let me come to our board member in the front, Dov Zakheim, Harlan, and we'll pick up in the front as well. Please, Masood, right to the front row.
Thanks very much. You briefly mentioned Kurdistan just in terms of the base that was hit. What do you, either of you, see as the future of Kurdistan if this sort of tension continues? Will they remain out of it because they're on good terms with both sides? Or do you think they're going to get sucked in?
Let me take just a couple of questions back to back. If you could pass the mic there to Harlan, and then we'll pick up this woman here at the back, and those three will come back to you.
I'm Harlan Ullman. Unfortunately, your comments and critique are unarguable. I would suggest, however, that this crisis has not been de-escalated. It's been deferred and delayed. And at some stage in the future, we're likely to be in a situation where force may be used. The president and his supporters are going to take great credit for what they've done, irrespective. It looks like the War Powers Act is not going to be passed, or at least be successful. And if impeachment does go to the Senate, it seems to me that the Senate is not going to convict, all of which will empower the president. So if those circumstances happen, what constraints do you think can be put to the president to prevent us from getting into a real war with Iran?
Thank you, Harlan. Final question for this round here.
Thank you very much. So my question is, yesterday,
please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Angel, and I'm with Hong Kong Phoenix Television. My question is, yesterday, President Trump claimed that Iran is standing down. Would you think that Iran is actually standing down? And he also commented that the U.S. doesn't need the Middle East for oil anymore. How would you think the U.S. allies in the Middle East would respond to that?
Well, listen, I think it is, the jury's still out as to whether Iran has stood down or not. As we've mentioned, the supreme leader and the political infrastructure in Tehran only has a limited ability to control actors inside Iraq that have very close proximity to U.S. forces. And I don't think we can say for certain whether Iran has closed up shop. And much of what they do, they cloak in deniability. And so I think you could also likely see other proxy actions in the future. And let me just make one comment on the future of Kurdistan. Obviously, the Kurdish region has to be part of the future of a unified Iraqi state. There frankly has been much progress made over the last few years on the oil claims and the division of oil revenues out of the Kurdish region. And that is why this is so dangerous, that we have now inserted the question of U.S. presence into Iraq as a wedge that will inevitably divide Kurds from Sunni from Shia at a moment where we needed them to be having the hard, tough conversations about how to build a nation together. All of a sudden, we are now going to be in the position of browbeating the Kurds to show up to parliament or to withdraw from parliament, whichever is best for our interests at the moment, in order to try to protect our troop presence there. And so, once again, we have created another crisis, a political crisis between the different ethnic groups inside Iraq that we didn't need to at a moment when it's incredibly dangerous.
Maybe I'll just quickly address the third question, which is how do we prevent this from happening again, which I share a concern. I mean, I have no problem saying that I think it would be incredibly naive to think that Iran is not going to retaliate further. They're just going to be smart about how they do so and choose the time and place of their attacks. One of the ways that I like to handle the administration officials coming before the Armed Services Committee or panel is to just simply ask the intelligence analysts to evaluate whether they're meeting their own policy goals. And when I laid out the administration's stated policy goals for Iran and how they're not meeting them, that's because it just points out that they can't even follow the logic to their own conclusions. And the reason why I think Senator Murphy and I have both talked about the nature of this intelligence and whether or not it was a new and imminent threat is because the implication is obviously that the administration is not following the law. So if they don't follow the logic of their own positions and they don't follow the law, then I think you have a real problem with assuming that the normal instruments of government, the normal checks and balances that exist here in Washington through the Congress and through the administration itself and through the United States military are going to be effective. And that is the real danger here. That's why I said we need to go so far as to calling on military officers to question their orders to make sure they're lawful. Because I think the normal checks and balances that prevent things like this from happening are not going to work.
So we're going to wrap. We're hitting the witching hour. If you have time, I might take the final comment from the front row, and then we can close to get you back to the Hill from Barbara Abbas. Just very quick, please.
Hi, Barbara Slavin. I direct our Future of Iran initiative. The president said that Iran was planning to bomb our embassy in Baghdad. Did you hear anything that would support that?
And Abbas, very quickly.
Thank you, and thank you both, Senator and Congressman. Abbas Kadhim, I direct the Iraq initiative at the Atlantic Council. It is clear that the U.S. forces are needed in Iraq to train the Iraqis, build capacity, and deter terrorism and many other things that we all know. But the Iraqi government right now, their argument is that there are not many troops to defend themselves as when you were in Iraq with the number that you had, and that getting them out of the harm's way is important. So what should be the position of Congress if the Iraqi government ends up asking the U.S. to pull their troops, and what would you be telling the administration on that? Thank you.
Your final comments.
Well, listen, I think, past needs to also be prelude. I don't know that we can rely on our efforts to train the Iraqi military as our primary prophylactic against the development of Sunni extremism. And so that's why I presented this council year after year that we need to reorient the way that we are allocating funding inside Iraq to make sure that the economic and political preconditions for a Sunni extremist movement is not there, because I'm just not sure that we are ever going to be able to have confidence that the Iraqi military is going to be able to repel that. I will just reiterate, because I don't want to comment on sort of specifics in the briefing. I will just say again what I said. that I did not hear in the briefing any evidence of a specific planned certain attack against the United States. I will say this, and you don't have Republicans here, and so let me argue their book for a moment. I've said this publicly. I don't believe that there was evidence presented of a specific imminent attack against the United States. But I understand that that analysis is often in the eye of the beholder and the person who is hearing the intel. And so I think reasonable people in these briefings could come to different conclusions. And so I will give my Republican colleagues who come to that different conclusion that concession.
Thank you. Final word, Congressman.
Well, first of all, I fully associate myself with the Senator's remarks with regards to the question on Iraq. And the only other thing I would add about the Baghdad embassy is the Baghdad embassy is always under attack. And the attacks were actually a lot worse 10 years ago. So to say whether or not Iran was planning on executing an attack or encouraging some militias in Baghdad to attack the US embassy is sort of like asking, is the sun going to come up in Iraq tomorrow? And by the way, it's always sunny in Iraq.
Well, as someone who had the chance to serve as Chief of Staff at our embassy in Baghdad in 2006, 2007, it's been a real pleasure to have both of you on this stage. Thank you for your time today. I know we've got to get you back up for votes. Please join me in thanking Senator Murphy, Congressman Oldham for their time. Thank you.